Doubts about the U.S. moon landing have never ceased since the last century. Some people suspect the U.S. never landed on the moon at all. They believe the footage was filmed in a studio. After all, even in today's highly advanced technological era, sending humans to the moon is still an extremely difficult task. Not to mention back then, when even pagers weren't widespread. Was the moon landing a hoax? Or did the U.S. truly achieve a miracle? These videos are a bit long, so I'll explain in detail the complete Apollo program and the evidence and explanations regarding the moon landing doubts. Shortly after World War II, the Cold War between the US and the USSR began. Both sides wanted technology that could strike enemies from afar, from their own territory. So both countries committed to developing ballistic missiles, hoping they could fly through space and bomb enemy territories. Thus, the space race began. The question was, who would take the lead in this race? Since missile and rocket technology were similar back then, both sides gave it their all to develop space technology and were afraid of being beaten to the punch. On October 4, 1957, the news that the Soviet Union had launched the first artificial satellite shocked the United States. The US had believed it would be the first in space, but the USSR unexpectedly overtook it. About 5 months later, the US launched the Explorer 1 satellite, trying to catch up. But in 1961, 3 years later, the Soviet Union struck another blow. They successfully sent a human into space, making Yuri Gagarin the first person in space. The US was now falling behind in the space race. Though they later sent astronauts into space, they still felt like they were losing to the USSR, so they were determined to reverse the situation by making the moon their goal. On May 25, 1961, US President Kennedy announced to the world his plan to land a human on the moon within 10 years and bring him back safely to Earth. Although Kennedy made this bold declaration of a manned moon landing, there were no smartphones at the time, no internet, and no GPS navigation. Landing a man on the moon in 10 years was no easy task under such conditions. NASA began to take action to realize the goal, naming the moon mission the Apollo program. To ensure the success of the Apollo program, NASA first needed to develop the necessary technologies. They built a rocket with 5 engines to launch the Apollo spacecraft. The rocket was as tall as a 36-story building, even taller than the Statue of Liberty. The rocket was only the first step, given how different space is from Earth. How would astronauts enter space, survive in space, and return safely to Earth? All of this needed testing. To do this, NASA launched the Mercury and Gemini programs. Through the Mercury program, learned how to keep humans alive in space. They sent people into Earth orbit and observed what technical support astronauts needed in space, how space affected their bodies, and how to safely bring them back. After gaining experience, NASA launched the more advanced Gemini program. This program sent 2 astronauts into Earth orbit at the same time. The astronauts learned how to stay in space for long durations, master docking and separation techniques, and test various equipment for the moon mission. The Gemini program was a key part of the Apollo program and one of the most difficult phases. 2 rockets were launched simultaneously, each carrying 2 astronauts. They entered Earth orbit together and practiced docking while flying at high speed, where any mistake could mean mission failure, resulting in destruction and death. Eventually, NASA overcame all the challenges. This greatly boosted their confidence in the moon landing. They were now ready for a manned moon landing. But in reality, the real test of landing on the moon had just begun. In 1967, after 6 years of preparation for the moon landing, they had mastered the technology needed to send humans to the moon and bring them back safely, and selected 3 astronauts before the actual moon landing. The astronauts still needed practice and rehearsal, so NASA built a launch simulator. It was a replica of the spacecraft that would soon go into space. On January 27, 1967, while the 3 astronauts were training in the simulator, a fire suddenly broke out. Unfortunately, the hatch of the simulator could only be opened from the outside. Trapped inside, the astronauts couldn't escape. All 3 astronauts sadly perished. This incident was a huge blow to NASA. The moon rocket hadn't even launched yet, and such a serious setback had already occurred. Although it was just a routine test, to honor these astronauts, named the simulation mission Apollo 1. Afterwards, NASA improved the spacecraft design and identified the flaws that caused the accident. They learned from the tragedy and resumed preparations for the moon landing. Then Apollo 2 and Apollo 3 were tested on the ground. Apollo 4 Apollo 5 and Apollo 6 conducted 3 unmanned spaceflights, and Apollo 7 carried out the first manned flight, orbiting the Earth 163 times. It lasted about 11 days and completed some essential tests. At this point, NASA was making rapid progress. Time was tight. The US didn't want to lose to the Soviet Union again. Next up was Apollo 8. Initially, the plan, like before, was to send 3 astronauts into Earth orbit. But due to time constraints, to avoid delays in the manned moon landing, NASA changed the plan at the last minute and decided to have Apollo 8 launch directly from Earth to the moon, orbiting it, and then returning. In December 1968, Apollo 8 was launched. The 3 astronauts left Earth orbit for the first time, beginning a long space journey. About 3 days later, they entered lunar orbit and orbited the moon 10 times. Apollo 8 became the first spacecraft to bring humans so close to the moon and orbit around it. After Apollo 8 returned to Earth, it gave NASA tremendous confidence. Only one step remained: landing humans on the moon. Just one step away. But the biggest challenge was still how to ensure the astronauts landed safely on the moon. Before that, let's first understand the structure of the Apollo spacecraft, because it played a key role in the journey from Earth to the moon. It played a crucial role. The Apollo spacecraft had 3 main parts. The first part was the command module. It was like the brain of the spacecraft, where astronauts controlled the spacecraft. It housed computers and navigation systems, and had a heat shield outside, used during re-entry to Earth to protect the astronauts from the intense heat caused by atmospheric friction. Next was the service module. It provided power to the spacecraft, as well as oxygen and water. It also contained an engine that helped the spacecraft travel to and from the moon. Finally, the lunar module. After entering lunar orbit, 2 astronauts would enter the lunar module. Then the lunar module would separate from the Apollo spacecraft, and the astronauts would ride in it to land on the moon's surface. After completing their tasks on the moon's surface, they would again board the lunar module and return to the Apollo spacecraft. Then they would detach the lunar module from the Apollo spacecraft, leaving it in lunar orbit to reduce the weight of the Apollo spacecraft so it could return safely to Earth. After the Apollo 8 test, NASA entered the final phase of the moon landing program. Previous space missions had already fully tested the command and service modules, but the lunar module still needed testing. Only after the lunar module passed the tests would NASA dare to land astronauts on the moon. Although the lunar module had undergone extensive testing on Earth, its performance in space still needed verification. Therefore, NASA decided to test the lunar module in Earth orbit, so they launched Apollo 9. This was the first launch of a fully equipped Apollo spacecraft. After entering Earth orbit, Apollo 9 practiced docking and undocking with the lunar module and conducted other tests. Eventually, the lunar module passed all tests. At this point, NASA was fully prepared for a moon landing, but the tragedy of Apollo 1 still haunted them. Despite being well prepared, they couldn't afford any mistakes, so they decided on one final comprehensive test mission. They launched Apollo 10. During this mission, the astronauts completed all procedures, except for actually landing on the moon. In Apollo 10, astronauts flew the lunar module around the moon for 8 hours. They were only 16 kilometers above the surface, but didn't touch down. They returned to Earth after completing the mission. In fact, Apollo 10 could have landed on the moon, but history was destined to be written by others, so they didn't take that final step. About 2 months later, that historic day finally arrived. The whole world was excited for the mission. Everyone hoped to witness this historic moment. The competition that began as a US-Soviet space race was no longer just about national rivalry, but about scientific and human progress. To send Apollo 11 to the moon, NASA's most powerful rocket, the Saturn V, was ready. Hundreds of thousands gathered to watch the launch of Apollo 11. Every TV channel covered it, and hundreds of millions watched, eager to witness this historic event. However, the man who once declared that humans would reach the moon within 10 years, President Kennedy, had been assassinated in 1963 and didn't live to see this day. To honor him, Apollo 11's launch site was named the Kennedy Space Center. Today, most of NASA's space missions still launch from there. On July 16, 1969, at 9:30 a.m., the Saturn V rocket launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. In just 12 minutes, it placed Apollo 11 into Earth's orbit. About 32 hours later, the command module, service module, and lunar module headed toward the moon. This historic mission carried 3 astronauts. Neil Armstrong was the mission commander. Collins was the command module pilot, responsible for flying to the moon, and Aldrin. He was the lunar module pilot. The command and service modules of Apollo 11 were named Columbia. The lunar module was named Eagle. 3 days later, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin moved from the command module to the Eagle lunar module. Collins stayed behind in the command module. Then Columbia and Eagle separated. Eagle began descending toward the moon. Around 8 p.m., Eagle approached the moon. Around 8:10, an alarm suddenly went off. Armstrong and Aldrin didn't know what was happening and asked Mission Control what to do. Mission Control told them to ignore the alarm because the lunar module was set to land automatically. However, the navigation system on the module was overloaded. Meanwhile, Collins was alone, orbiting the moon in the Columbia module, closely monitoring the Eagle to ensure its safe landing. At that moment, Armstrong looked out the window and saw that the lander was about to touch down in an area full of craters and large boulders. This meant a crash was likely upon landing. At just 150 meters above the moon's surface, Armstrong decisively took manual control and chose to land 6 kilometers ahead of the original site. NASA knew how risky this mission was. Success odds were less than 50%. Any small error could lead to failure. The astronauts were facing grave danger. In fact, US President Nixon at the time had already prepared an alternate speech in case the astronauts perished. The Eagle slowly descended toward the moon. Aldrin then noticed that only 5% of fuel remained. He didn't know if the Eagle could land successfully or if the mission would be aborted. Mission Control also began the countdown. Tension filled the control room. Everyone held their breath, hearts pounding. If the Eagle didn't land before the countdown ended, the mission would have to be aborted. The Eagle's main engine would ignite and return it to Columbia. The astronauts would head back to Earth. At 8:10, the Eagle successfully landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. This day was forever etched into history. During landing, the engine's thrust kicked up lunar dust. Since the moon has no atmosphere and low gravity, this dust took about 65 hours to fully settle. Because lunar dust could damage the lander's equipment, the astronauts had to wait until it fully settled before putting on their suits and opening the hatch. At 2:46 a.m. on July 21st, Armstrong was the first to step onto the moon. About 20 minutes later, Aldrin also stepped onto the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin together performed many activities on the moon. They took many photos, planted the American flag, spoke with the US president, and placed many scientific instruments for more in-depth lunar research. They also collected about 23 kilograms of rocks and soil samples. Later, the two returned to the Eagle, launched from the moon and docked with Columbia, and finally headed back to Earth. Before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, they separated the service module from the command module because only the command module was built to return to Earth. The service module had rocket engines that were designed after separation to push the service module away so it wouldn't disintegrate in the atmosphere and damage the command module with debris. Unfortunately, during the return process, after separation from the command module, the service module's engines failed and it re-entered Earth's atmosphere with the command module. As the command module entered the atmosphere, it turned into a fireball due to friction, but its heat shield protected the astronauts from extreme temperatures. After the parachutes deployed, the command module safely landed on Earth. All 3 astronauts returned successfully. The manned landing of Apollo 11 became the top story of newspapers and TV stations worldwide. The astronauts became overnight celebrities, but questions soon arose. Why did the US just happen to land on the moon before the end of the decade? Could it have been, during the Cold War, an American scheme to show dominance? Was the moon landing a hoax? NASA's moon mission sparked many questions. Some believed NASA never landed on the moon, and that the footage was filmed in a studio. They deceived the entire world. But is this claim really true? And regarding the so-called moon landing hoax, what evidence and suspicious points support it? Next, I've summarized a few popular online doubts for analysis. The first suspicion, the waving flag. When NASA released photos and videos of the moon landing, people were surprised to find that the American flag on the moon appeared to wave in the wind. As we all know, flags wave on Earth because of the atmosphere. But the moon has no atmosphere at all, so how could the flag be waving? To answer this, NASA explained that when the astronauts planted the flag into the lunar surface, it shook due to the external force. And to make the flag appear more noticeable, they deliberately installed a horizontal rod on it. It's precisely because of this rod that the flag appears to be waving in the wind. The second suspicion, the photo. The photo of Aldrin standing on the moon. This photo is said to have been taken by Armstrong. Now, if we look closely at the reflection on Aldrin's helmet, we can clearly see the Eagle lander and Armstrong's silhouette. But in this reflection, we don't see any shadow of a camera, and Armstrong isn't holding a camera either. So here's the question: who exactly took this photo? Regarding this photo, NASA insists it was taken by Armstrong. They explain that the camera was mounted on Armstrong's spacesuit, near his chest. That's why in the photo, we don't see Armstrong holding a camera in his hand. But if we observe the photo more carefully, we'll notice Armstrong's hand seems to be reaching toward his chest area, which seems to confirm that he was operating the camera at that moment. The third suspicion, the stars. On Earth, when night falls and we look up at the sky, we can always see twinkling stars. However, in the photos released by NASA that were taken from the moon, not a single star is visible. NASA explained this by saying the moon's surface is highly reflective. Because of this, when sunlight hits the moon's surface, most of it gets reflected. It's precisely due to this intense reflection on the moon's surface that it's hard to immediately see the stars from there. Also for this reason, when taking photos on the moon, astronauts used fast exposure settings, but with such settings, the camera couldn't focus on the stars in the background light. That's why in lunar photos, we don't see stars in the sky. The fourth suspicion, the shadows. We all know that in the presence of a light source, the shadow of an object always appears in the opposite direction of the light. And if multiple objects are present, their shadows should all point in the same direction and be of the same length. But in the photos taken from the moon, we see shadows pointing in different directions. And in some photos, some shadows appear short, while others look very long. According to common sense, if the light source is directly behind an object, the shadow should be quite long. If the light source is above the object, the shadow should be shorter. However, on the moon, the sun is the only light source, so logically, shadows of objects with the same height should be in the same direction and have the same length. Therefore, in the eyes of conspiracy theorists, these photos seem to have been taken with multiple light sources. As for this question, NASA explained that the moon's surface is uneven and full of craters. Precisely because of this, on the moon, the shadows of objects can appear in different lengths and directions. When we observe mountains on Earth, because of their uneven terrain, we'll also notice shadows forming in different directions, some long, some short. On such rugged terrain, shadows really don't align in the same direction or length. At the time, NASA addressed every question about the moon landing. Still, many people kept questioning NASA's moon landing. But there was one country that remained unusually silent. That country was America's biggest rival at the time, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as America's strongest adversary during the Cold War, had always kept a close watch on every move the US made. However, at the time, the Soviet Union did not question the US moon landing. The reason behind this was that the Soviets knew the US had indeed successfully landed on the moon. The Apollo program continued until Apollo 17, and NASA successfully sent humans to the moon 6 times in total. With the help of modern technology, satellites sent to the moon have captured many high-resolution NASA's landing sites. From these photos, it's clear to see that NASA indeed landed on the moon, because in every landing mission, NASA left behind advanced scientific instruments on the moon. These instruments are still quietly lying on the lunar surface today. NASA's manned moon landings weren't a one-time event, but happened 6 times. The entire Apollo program involved around 400,000 people. If America's moon landing was fake, that would mean those 400,000 people in the Apollo program all took part in creating a century-defining lie. Getting 400,000 people to lie isn't hard, but getting 400,000 people to keep the same lie a secret is nearly impossible. News would leak, let alone with 400,000 mouths. In addition, the equipment and remains left on the moon from the Apollo missions, like the lunar module debris, rover tracks, and astronauts' footprints, have been confirmed multiple times by modern detectors. Countless pieces of evidence and scientific consensus all point to a clear conclusion. Humans did indeed complete 6 manned moon landings between 1969 and 1972.